Welcome to our true crime podcast, Death of the Decades, where we are going to talk about who's responsible for the death of the 1920s. I'm Lauren.
I'm Maddie.
I'm Lily.
I'm Elida, and we are your hosts today.
In today's episode, we will go over who is responsible for the death of the 1920s based on suspects from the novel The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald.
Before that, let's talk about what the 1920s were like.
The 1920s were known as the Jazz Age, or the Roaring Twenties, because of the unprecedented patterns of consumption in America with the emergence of new music and modes of transportation. Jazz, originating from the blues and ragtime, spread nationwide in the 20s and often played in city saloons and brothels. Additionally, the integration of the Ford Model T, the first reasonable car that an average wage-working American could afford, led to a change in how Americans spent their free time. Now, people could go out of cities and explore new places like never before, which led to the birth of drive-in restaurants and motels. However, the cultural aspects of the 1920s do not sufficiently capture the full picture of the decade. What are some details about this period, Lily?
According to my extensive research, I'm building a time machine to experience what the 1920s were like. This new vibrant consumer culture emerged as a result of the economic boom. American industry greatly expanded during World War I to supply for the war, and consequently much more jobs opened up. With more jobs accessible, ordinary people now had enough money to buy things other than necessities, such as cars.
Are we going to ignore the fact that Lily time traveled?
Yes.
Okay then. Although the 20s were roaring, there were much darker aspects of that time period. For example, nativism was on the rise, and there were still massive discriminatory groups such as the KKK, a group made up of white supremacists who believed America should be fully white and Protestant. They lynched and terrorized black people while encouraging Jim Crow laws, which were enforced by state and local laws to restrict black people's rights and increase racial segregation within the South. Most of the fantasies known to the 1920s were mainly limited to upper-class white males, as other ethnicities were suffering from racial discrimination.
On top of that, poverty had increased as well as the gap between the rich and poor. Lower-class workers were subject to unsafe working conditions surrounded by dangerous hazards and unsanitary environments. There were also major tensions during the 1920s, such as the prohibition of alcohol, which led to the rise of organized crime and bootlegging.
Now that we understand the environment of this decade, let's go over our suspects who may have killed the 1920s.
With some interrogation and observation, we're going to focus on 4 possible characters who may be responsible for the crime. Only one will become our prime suspect.
Let's start off with Nick Carraway. He is the narrator of the novel who lives in New Money, West Egg. At the beginning of the novel, he assures the audience that he reserves all judgment, yet he soon contradicts himself. He puts himself in the position of an unreliable narrator, meaning that we cannot trust everything that he is describing since everything is in his perspective and under his bias. Most of the time, Nick only observes and is a bystander to most of the situations. He often makes no effort to speak out against things that he does not find right, and at the same time jumps to conclusions and judgments in his narrative. There were many people like Nick during the 1920s who, once they were comfortable, they would make minimal effort to help society, or were too scared to do so due to wealthier people's influence over them.
In addition to Carraway's biased perspective, Tom Buchanan, the husband of Daisy Buchanan, is another suspect in our investigation. Buchanan has an athletic build thanks to his football career at Yale University and comes from a wealthy family, whose riches have been passed down for generations. Thus, Tom and Daisy live in East Egg, where all the old money, or people who have inherited their wealth, reside. Both Buchanan's physical capabilities and prosperous family have led him to a position of immense privilege over the rest of society. Because of this status, he often feels entitled to his power, even though it was essentially given to him by his family. Buchanan's superiority in the world is reflected in his actions, such as when he showers his wife with expensive gifts, but has an affair with no secrecy or shame. He knows he has power over Daisy and the woman he has an affair with. Tom's abuse of power and materialism can be interpreted as contributing to the downfall of the 20s, making him a suspect.
Our next suspect is Daisy. She is a young, pretty woman who is the wife of the rich and popular Tom Buchanan. Because of her marriage to Tom, she is classified as wealthy in society. She is described by many as beautiful and the golden girl. A unique aspect about her characteristic that lots notice about her would be her thrilling voice that is full of money. Daisy doesn't necessarily fall in love with people. She falls in love with their wealth and the idea of having money. She is known to be careless because of this, which has severe consequences. For example, she chooses to not own up to the murder of Myrtle after she had run Myrtle over with Gatsby's car. Because of her careless actions, Gatsby and Mr. Wilson also end up dead. Carelessness is a characteristic that contributed to the death of the 1920s, making her a suspect.
And last but not least, the murder of the 1920s. Our prime suspect is Jay Gatsby. He is a 32-year-old wealthy man who lives in a West Egg mansion. He tells his acquaintances that he was a child of rich parents and that he attended Oxford, but in reality, he comes from poor farmers and came to wealth from bootlegging. He constructed this perfect lie of a life to attract Daisy, a woman he had met just before he left for war. To do this, he buys a glamorous mansion just across from hers, and he throws extravagant parties every weekend to attract her attention. Gatsby represents the stereotypical American dream, where he rises from the bottom and is devoted to chasing his goals.
While the other characters certainly have their faults, we have selected Gatsby to be our prime suspect because his grim and harmful actions led to the death of the American dream, therefore causing the death of the 1920s.
One of the problematic things about Gatsby is how he views Daisy as an object. At first glance, Gatsby looks like a hopeless romantic who is chasing his love, but the way he pursues her is pretty creepy. It becomes clear that Gatsby sees Daisy as a conquest that will fill a hole in his life. Rather than a woman he loves, she is an enchanted object. After he left his farm in North Dakota and then left Daisy for war, Gatsby has been a wanderer. He says, "I usually find myself among strangers because I drift here and there to forget the sad things that happen to me." Gatsby believes that his emptiness and sadness stems from his societal status and separation from Daisy.
Gatsby wants to recover something that he had lost of himself, and he believed that if he could once return to a certain starting place and go over it all slowly, he could find out what that thing was. That thing, of course, being Daisy and wealth. However, because of Gatsby's belief that Daisy will complete his life, he has no other goals and he separates himself from normal socialization, which makes him more unhappy. Gatsby runs away from his problems and pins them on other things, causing him to never improve and to always be unsatisfied.
Gatsby is also initially attracted to Daisy for her money. When he met her, he imagined however glorious might be his future as Jay Gatsby, he was at present a penniless young man without a past. He idolized Daisy and wealth, believing that they will make his life glorious and meaningful. Because of this idolization, Gatsby goes to extensive measures, such as bootlegging to make money and tailoring every aspect of his life to Daisy.
In our investigation, Gatsby sees no problems with these actions. He brushes off the criticism he gets for bootlegging from Tom and ignores that bootlegging was a large factor in the instability of the 1920s economy, which led to the Great Depression. And when told by Nick that he can't expect Daisy to be the same as she was 5 years ago, he responds, "Can't repeat the past? Why, of course he can."
This leads us to our next accusation against Gatsby. He is entitled to wealth in Daisy, causing his downfall and the death of the American dream. He cannot accept that time moves past him because he is entitled and feels that his status and hard work puts him above the passage of time. This is a common characteristic among wealthy people in the 1920s. The American dream convinced them that with hard work, you can have anything.
The American dream has been an admired value of American society for many years, and it was very popular in the 1920s after the economic boom. Social mobility became more possible for average people as more jobs opened up and the economy improved. However, the American dream was still very elusive and restrictive to mostly white men. Fitzgerald uses Gatsby's rise in wealth due to bootlegging and consequent entitlement to Daisy from his new wealth to criticize the rich who believe in the fair American dream. When people attain success or their goals, they are still left feeling empty and unsatisfied, becoming greedy for more.
Another example of Gatsby's entitlement comes from when he demands Daisy to leave Tom and renounce her love for him. Against Daisy's wishes, Gatsby confronts Tom and speaks on behalf of Daisy, telling him, "She never loved you, do you hear? She only married you because I was poor and she was tired of waiting for me." Daisy responds and says that she has loved both men, to which Gatsby is shocked and responds with, "You loved me too?"
Daisy's love is not enough for Gatsby. In order for him to be satisfied, she has to say that she never loved Tom and that he, Gatsby, was the only one she's ever loved. Gatsby feels like he has lost, proving his entitlement to Daisy and how he views Daisy as a conquest to win. Although he claims to be different from Tom, who views Daisy as an object, Gatsby is simply the same.
All of this comes together to cause Gatsby's downfall at the end of the novel. Gatsby takes the blame for Myrtle's death on behalf of Daisy, causing him to get shot by Myrtle's husband, who is out for revenge. Gatsby's blind attachment to Daisy is the cause of his death. Gatsby had not achieved his dreams, and the consequence of his greed resulted in his death.
Gatsby's death can be seen as a symbol of the death of the American dream, and although it may seem harsh, Gatsby was responsible for his own death because he could not let go of Daisy and takes the blame for her as one last attempt to win her back. Since Gatsby symbolizes the American dream and he caused his own death, Gatsby killed the American dream. And because the American dream defined the fake prosperity of the roaring 1920s, Gatsby killed the 1920s.
So far, a lot of evidence points to Gatsby being guilty, but I think Daisy is also very suspicious.
What makes you say that?
The voices in my head.
JK. As described before, Daisy is a careless, wealthy person who chooses to be blind to the consequences of her actions. She kills Myrtle in a hit and run and doesn't take responsibility for it, allowing Gatsby to take the blame and face the consequences by being killed by George, Myrtle's husband.
She also represents the lack of morality of the rich in the 1920s that would hurt and exploit others while running away from their actions, a trait that can be interpreted as killing the 1920s.
Those are all great pieces of evidence for Daisy's faults, but it's important to remember that Daisy has to be a fool to survive in the world. For instance, she explains that she hopes her daughter will be a fool to ease the pain of the harsh reality of being a woman in this time period. Without being able to marry a wealthy man, she would be nobody. Also, fun fact, the line about being a fool was stolen from Zelda Fitzgerald, Scott Fitzgerald's wife, bringing more painful truth to it.
Daisy chooses to be a fool and complacent so Tom doesn't see her as rebelling against him. It can also be assumed that Daisy knows about Tom's abusive tendencies, which were shown between him and his mistress, Myrtle. Women in the 20s were oppressed under the power of men, even if their wealth was considered equal.
After all, Gatsby almost sees her as a reward to the effort he put in to spread his influence and grow his wealth. Even Nick pointed out how men like Gatsby and Tom would obsess over women and their disembodied faces floating along the dark cornices.
That's definitely terrifying and obsessive. Even though such a social problem includes women like Daisy, it's men that end up pressuring her to act as a fool to keep herself safe, and Gatsby contributes to this problem, making him more of a suspect to bring down the 1920s.
To wrap up on today's talk, let's recap on why Gatsby is responsible for killing the 1920s.
Gatsby is responsible for the death because of his irresponsible entitlement to the American dream. He fixates on the idea of the American dream and gaining wealth because it gives him hope for a better life, but because of this fixation, he only sees people and things as ways to achieve his goals. He then becomes entitled to them, such as his entitlement to Daisy's love and loyalty.
When he finally accomplished his goal of wealth through bootlegging and got Daisy to love him again, Gatsby had yet another accomplishment he wanted to complete for himself. He wanted Daisy to leave Tom and to never look back. He's unsatisfied by any other outcome because he cannot accept that time moves past him and that the American dream doesn't promise to fulfill one's life. His dissatisfaction leads him to his death, therefore killing the American dream and bringing down the 1920s.